Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 29th of October 2025. We're here to discuss child poverty as part of our work ahead of the budget on the 26th of November. And I'm delighted to welcome as witnesses today to talk about child poverty, Jonathan, from my left to right, Dr. Jonathan Cribb, who's the Deputy Director and the Head of Retirement Savings and Ageing at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So welcome to you, Dr. Cribb. He's joined by Professor Kitty Stewart, who's the Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics, and Sophie Howes, who's the Head of Policy at the Child Poverty Action Group. So thank you very much indeed for coming. I should probably just declare for the record that Professor Stewart and I are acquainted because Professor Stewart is a constituent of mine. So thank you, I just thought it was worth saying. And I think Mr. Bobby Dean MP has a declaration.
Yeah, just declaring he's a family member that works for Save the Children.
Thank you very much indeed. So obviously child poverty has been discussed a lot, and one of the reasons we're talking about it is that there may be potentially changes at the budget. And one of the things that is discussed is about future trends in child poverty, and that's one of the reasons it's high up on the agenda. What's your assessment of the trends in child poverty given the current situation, and how do you think, well, what any particular concerns you've got about that? Perhaps I'll start from my left to right, Dr. Cribb, if you could go first.
Yes, it's always a little bit difficult projecting these things, and we don't undertake official kind of particular projects on this. In general, you would think that poverty and child poverty would rise over time if benefits are rising less fast than earnings of workers, and so in general, people who do these kind of projections will generally project gradual increases in poverty. Where I would really focus groups of concern would be larger families. They're more reliant on benefits than working income from earnings, and private renters because of the local housing allowance rates, which are frozen at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Professor Stewart.
Yeah, I would go with the projections from the Resolution Foundation, which I think are very consistent with what IFS have put out. So we've seen child poverty. We've seen child poverty rising since 2012-13. That was the kind of bottom that we've seen, about 27%. Now up to about 31%. And the Resolution Foundation's projection is 34% by the end of this Parliament, which would take us right back to the mid-1990s before the last Labour government took office. And I would just emphasise that the increase is entirely concentrated among children living in families with 3 or more children. So they've seen their poverty risk rise from about a third to about half, and the projection is that it will rise further.
Sophie Howes, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I won't kind of repeat what my fellow experts have said, but I think it might just be helpful to kind of understand exactly why low-income families are so kind of reliant on social security, and why the cuts to social security have had a real impact for this particular group. So, low-income families are reliant on employment and social security to get by. So I think it's a basic point, but I think something that's really important to remember when we're thinking about child poverty is that wages don't adjust for family size. So for low-income families, they are very dependent on the social security system to meet those basic living costs. And so when that system is stripped back, they are particularly vulnerable, and my colleagues have kind of talked about what we can expect to see going forward, and those projected rises which link to the two-child limit, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I think it is also worth just reflecting back on what's happened since 2010. So at CPAG we estimate that £50 billion per year has actually been taken out of the social security system if we compare to 2010 levels of spending. So that's a huge amount, and actually, if you correlate that with rising child poverty, you can see that very, very clear link between child poverty and social security spending.
Now, it's difficult, again, you've talked about difficult to project, but one of the things that's a challenge is our birth rate, which is very low in England. I think it's only in Luton that it's at 2.1. I think in the City of London it's below 1. It's very, but that's, I suppose the City of London is a particular, perhaps not an outlier. But nevertheless, it's not at the level it needs to be. Do you think that will obviously have an impact on statistics, and how do you account for that when you're measuring this projections about child poverty? Because you've got fewer children, you have fewer numbers. Obviously, you're looking at percentages. Do you want to just talk us through, one of you, perhaps, how that has an impact on these numbers. Anyone?
Well, I guess we look at both percentages.
Professor Stewart, yeah.
We look at both percentages and numbers, and that's important, because if you just look at numbers, you might end up showing that the numbers are going to fall, and that's just because you've got fewer children. So I think that's why it's really important to.
And obviously birth rate there'll be different demographics around birth rate as well. So that's the average. Have there anything you can inform us about certain demographic groups that might be in the category, perhaps with larger families, which have you already all indicated are more likely to have children in poverty?
Yes, well, there are some significant differences by ethnicity, certainly. So, in fact, some groups are more likely to have larger families, or to have 3 or more children than others. And that's one reason why the 2-child limit is actually falling very disproportionately on some groups rather than others. So I can give you some more numbers on that if it's useful, but that's one reason that we would be concerned. Sorry, I do have some numbers on that.
So I don't have numbers, but I know, Pakistani and Bangladeshi families are generally poorer, generally more likely to be affected by 2-child limit, for example, because they have 3 or more families, 3 or more children. I know they have, on average, higher fertility. I don't personally know if their fertility trends have tracked other ethnicities as fertility has come down.
Yeah, they have. Fertility is coming down among most groups, so it's not that but they're still more likely to have. Some groups are more likely to have a 3rd child than others. So I think children from black or mixed or multiple ethnicities are over 3 times as likely to be affected by the 2-child limit as children from white families. And children from Asian families are more than twice as likely to be affected. And we need to remember that those children from those families are already at higher risk of poverty because of other structural factors to do with employment and pay and so on. And so this is kind of coming on top and exacerbating those risks. Should also say that 75% of children affected by the 2-child limit are in white families. So we need to remember, there's a difference between the kind of composition and the risk, but it is increasing. I was going to come on to that, because actually, yes, a high percentage of people are in work. And obviously, something like over 50% of people on receipt of universal credit are in work. So that we know that a lot of benefits go to people in work. So given if we pull back to the child poverty strategy, which the government's it delayed from being launched before the summer, we're still waiting to see that. Where do you think it should be focusing, given that such a high percentage of children in poverty have a parent in work? Do you think that's relevant, Ms. Howes?
Yeah, I think employment can clearly play a really critical role in the strategy. So I think at CPAG we'd say that the child poverty strategy does need to really squarely focus on increasing family income, and there are 2 primary ways that you can do that. You can do that through employment, and you can do that through social security. But I think it's important to highlight that many of the gains around parents stepping into employment have already sort of been made. If you look at lone parent employment in particular, there's been huge strides in that, and Kitty will probably have more of the figures on some of that. And I think it's just really important to understand the sort of barriers that this particular group face in terms of increasing their employment or increasing their wages. We know, if we look at the kind of composition of low-income families, that actually many of them who are not working face really high barriers to work. So they've got kind of either young children at home, they're disabled themselves, they might be looking after a disabled child. So all of those things are factors at play. So I think when you have that kind of quite high employment barriers and just that sort of basic point I made at the beginning around wages not adjusting for family size, that's where we see that kind of critical role of social security stepping in to top up incomes alongside employment.
Do you think there's anything specific that child poverty strategy should be doing around work to help increase the incomes of low-income households?
I think there's definitely more that can be done in terms of investing in tailored employment support for parents, and I think we'd really like to see that as part of some of the work that DWP is doing. And I think that has been a focus of the department, so that's really reassuring. But I think it's just really important for the committee to understand that will get you, some gains in terms of child poverty reduction. You can spend billions and billions of pounds on employment support and not move the dial much on child poverty. We're talking about say 50 to 100,000 families or parents moving into work. These are the kind of correlating child poverty reductions are quite small when you look at how you might spend, say, if you scrap the two-child limit today, you'd spend 2 billion and lift 350,000 children out of poverty. So it's just kind of when you're looking at what's most cost effective, I think you do need to consider that.
So, and also it's cost effective in the short term, and then there's a long term. So I suppose so both could be considered. Professor Stewart.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I mean, so we'd certainly want to see employment support, childcare, fixing some of the problems with the childcare system, upfront costs and so on, which there's been some work done on, but still those are presenting big barriers. But important to realise that is really expensive. It's not a cheap fix. I think sometimes people think, well, we can just get people into work and that does this for free. But that's not the case. The second thing is that actually, when you look at the role that employment plays, it's going to be it's important, but it's going to be a relatively small part of the strategy for various reasons that we can go into. And it needs to operate with the social security system. So one thing I would say about how to make work for families is that many families in work, even where parents are working full time, need support from the social security system through child benefits. Because wages don't adjust, as Sophie has said, and that's something that we've known for a long time, for a century or more, and that's why we have child benefits in the first place. That's why family allowances were introduced. We've just done some new work, and it shows that firstly that it's much harder for a larger family to escape poverty through work. Even where an adult moves into full-time work, they're much less likely to be lifted over the poverty line than a family with one or two children, because the needs are greater, and that's not adjusted through work. And the other thing is that over the last decade, it's become much harder for those families to escape poverty through work. So it used to be the case that something like if an adult moved into full-time work with 3 children, a decade ago it was something like 60% of those families would be lifted out of poverty, and now it's more like 30 to 40%. And that's because of the loss of those social security benefits. So this isn't like benefits are for non-working people and work is for working people. You need the social security system even if you're working often. And the two-child limit is affecting many working families.
I mean, the thing I'd add to here is the role of housing costs, actually, because when, why are people moving into work and not getting out of poverty? Well, partly there might be how is the social security supporting? There's also housing costs, and we did a study looking at the changes in in-work poverty from the mid-1990s up to the pandemic, and the biggest single factor of why in-work poverty had risen, not the level, but how it had risen, was increased housing costs that were focused on particularly hitting middle and poorer income families. So there is now different people are going to want to use different policy levers to address housing costs, but I think there is an additional issue there on top of essentially work and social security.
Well, there's lots to dig through there, so I'm going to pass to John Grady MP to continue.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. That's a question for Professor Stewart. Do we have reliable evidence on the quantifiable consequences of child poverty for the individual children's education, employment and health outcomes?
Yes, we do. We have. I mean, we're always wanting more evidence, but there's a growing body of quite of rigorous research which looks at the causal effect of child poverty on children's outcomes.
What does it tell us?
It tells us that poverty is not, essentially, to summarise, it tells us that poverty is not the whole story. The low income is not the whole story of why children who grow up in low-income households do less well, but it is a very significant part of the story. So we did some estimates I've done a systematic review on this. We did some estimates, and our rough calculations were that you could make about half of the differences between children growing up in poverty and those not could be explained by the low income itself. And there are lots of robust studies that show that when families in low income receive more support, receive more income, it makes a difference to children's educational outcomes, to aspects of their health, to their social and behavioural outcomes. And we've also got quite good stories or quite good research kind of digging into why that might be. And it's partly because families spend money on their children if you give them more money, the things that children need, from the sort of basic needs to supporting education and so on. It's also very important for maternal mental health and depression, and those things have a knock-on effect on children.
So low incomes you see as a significant cause of child poverty, and therefore the outcomes that affect those individual children in terms of education, employment and health outcome later on. So how does that evidence that you've referred to affect the case for payments to families by the government to reduce poverty and improve those outcomes?
I think it makes a very strong case that this is something the government should be doing, both because there's a moral case that we're in a rich country and children should enjoy their childhoods. They only get one chance at it, and it's not fair that so many children are going without many kind of basic needs and being able to enjoy their childhood, but also because we know that this evidence tells us that we're really wasting talent by not investing in our children. There's a strong investment case, and we know also that there are knock-on immediate effects, costs for other public services who are having to sort of pick up the pieces, and there are good estimates of the kind of long-term costs, what we're losing in terms of these children's lost potential and future earnings and so on.
I'm very lucky to be the MP for a seat with wonderful children, but unfortunately blighted with some of the highest child poverty in the United Kingdom, in Glasgow. So thinking about those individual children, I wonder, Ms Howes, if you've got anything to add to what Professor Stewart has said.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say, the evidence is really clear. Kitty's cited a lot of it, but I think particularly when you look at some of the kind of more qualitative research that both Kitty and colleagues has conducted, and actually Nesta and IFS did a series of interviews with parents affected by the two-child limit, and they talk really clearly about kind of reduced access to formal childcare, reduced access to extracurricular activities, reduced opportunities to play and being able to socialise. So I think we can all identify that those are things that do have like an impact on children's development and their education. I just thought it might be helpful to read a quote from a series of interviews that we did with families that were affected by the two-child limit. There's a couple with 3 children. They're a working household, so the father in full-time work. As a family, we've just started to rely on food banks. Winter months are horrendous as we can't afford a big gas bill, so we have to bundle the children with extra blankets. We've just moved to a property with no carpet, and there's no possible way of affording a carpet. We're limited to 2 loads of washing a week as we just can't afford to top up the electricity meter. The adults of the house skip meals so children can have full stomachs. My mental health has deteriorated greatly due to the guilt of not being able to provide for the family. My oldest is 11 and we've never been on holiday with him. My partner is hardly at home because he works so hard to keep us afloat, so he's missing so much of his children's upbringing. So I think we can all see that there are many aspects of that quote that really just relate to lots of different things that are really important for children and for childhood, and that's the day-to-day experience of families.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms Howes. And just a quick yes-no one to this, if you'd be so kind. I take it your position is that there is a strong case for payments to families by the government to alleviate child poverty.
Yes.
And Dr. Cribb, coming to you, have you got anything to add to what Professor Stewart and Professor Howes has said?
Yeah, I want to very slightly push back on my reading of the evidence, where I think that there are certainly papers that show that income can have an important impact, in those contexts do have an important impact on child development, on education. I don't think it's unanimous. My colleagues at Nesta have looked in particular at the effects of the 2-child limit, which generates this big change in income depending on exactly when the 3rd child is born, basically before or after April 2017. They haven't found any impact of that change in income on school readiness. That's measured at age 5 in reception. They've looked at various subgroups and they can't see any impacts there. It doesn't mean to say there wouldn't be impacts at later ages. It doesn't mean to say there wouldn't be other impacts on health. There are, of course, impacts on poverty, which we can go into. In the main, I agree with my colleagues here. I don't speak with as much certainty, I think, about quite the state of knowledge
So, am I taking from you that you would say it's more likely than not, first of all, but low income causes child poverty or contributes to it and leads to poorer outcomes, but there is some evidence that points the other way? Is that what you're saying?
Low income absolutely causes child poverty. I mean, in a sense, it's definitional, but and that is important in of itself. I think the reading of the literature is slightly more mixed about the extent to which I'm going to call small to medium changes in income for poor children lead to quantifiable effects on educational performance. I think there are some studies where it does, and there are some studies where it doesn't. And I know that's not potentially the most helpful thing to say, but I just don't think it's unanimous that we know that this is going to have big, changes in income are going to have big effects on education.
Last question from me, Professor Stewart, to kind of give a wee response to that.
I think we do know, it may not show up in every study, but I think the reason, so I've done a systematic review where you look at the reason why it's important to kind of look at across the evidence is to get the big picture, right? And it's absolutely true that not every study finds effect. So my systematic review, and there's a more recent one in Journal of Economic Perspectives, I think, a US one, we both reached the same strong conclusion that the evidence points strongly to the fact that there are effects, including on education, when you look at the body of evidence as a whole. And in fact, we both find that there is a variation of, there's a variation of effect, and the sort of money that comes through something like the two-child limit is exactly the sort of support that other study you would expect to be. So money makes more difference to low-income households. It makes more difference when it's consistent over time, reliable for families. So the new IFS result with the EYFS is surprising in the scope of that literature. And I think it's worth thinking about why we're not picking up an effect. And I think there are a number of possible reasons why that is. One is the measure itself, which is something which is whether you reach a good level of development. This is something that actually is the group of, don't want to get too much into the methodology, but the group of children you're looking at here are larger families living on low incomes who are younger in the year because of the way that you have to identify them. All of those things point to it being very, very difficult. A minority, something like 30 to 40% of those children will reach a good level of development. So what you're doing is taking children at the bottom of the distribution, making them more disadvantaged, and then saying, are we seeing, are you doing even worse than you were? I would expect to see we would show up impacts, but I think we need to keep in mind what we're looking at, which is a blunt measure, age 5. We also need to remember that this is a heavily COVID-affected year group. They turned 5 in April 2022, so there's another disadvantage on top of them. They should have started preschool in September 2020, and of course many of them all missed out. And then the final thing is that I think we might not, if anyone is, we know that parents do their best to protect children. And I think it's easier, certainly our qualitative research talking to parents, it's easier for them to do that when their children are young. That when we ask parents, how are your children affected, if parents of young children tend to say they don't know about it, and I'm trying to protect them from those impacts. With older children, it's much, much more difficult. Children who are going to school, who are wanting to join the football club, who are not able to get a haircut, so they're feeling embarrassed about going to school, all sorts of ways in which these things I would expect to get worse further on. So I think we need to look at the big picture, and we need to be a bit careful about.
We also need to make sure that the government's got proper evaluation in place for any of the measures it may or may not introduce.
Absolutely, yeah, that's important.
Thank you. And delighted to welcome Debbie Abrahams MP, who's chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, guesting here today.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to follow up from John, if I may. First of all, in terms of the impact on, or the evidence on the impact of child poverty on NEETs. I have a preprint of some work from the UK Millennium Cohort Study, which is showing quite a strong impact. You're 5 times more likely to be NEET if you have experienced child poverty, prolonged child poverty for that period. But I think that also reflects international evidence. So it's just really to see if you have got similar evidence, if you'd like to comment on that. I think the other aspect of that was also around the family adversity aspect as well.
Yes, I don't know. I'm not sure I know that particular study, but certainly consistent with I think what we would expect, because we see that child poverty is not only correlated with, but causally correlated with children's ability to do well in school. So of course, what you're seeing there might be, I need to look at the details. Like some of that may reflect other factors about those children's households and families and the education that they're able to get. But it seems very likely that part of it is the impact of child poverty coming through.
Yeah. Anything that internationally that you've come across saying
on
similar
NEET
stuff?
Specifically, no, I don't think so. I will have a think about that.
Well, I mean, in some sense, these differences based on where you grow up are quite shocking in terms of the family situation in which you grow up. As Kitty said, that's going to be a range of different things. I think the thing I'd like to point out is that there is evidence that being out of work, struggling to find appropriate work or training in that kind of adolescent period is really bad for you over a longer period as well. There are kind of these scarring effects. People.
Yes.
So
specifically about the impact of child poverty.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that why do we care about this? We care about this because it's poor children. We care about it because you're being out of work at this point. And my point is that an additional reason to care about this is that there's long-term impacts of this NEET
the NEET
status.
That we have, for example, and it's very much in the public domain and is a source of interest. As I say, this is currently being peer-reviewed, but a preprint is showing that from large data sets is showing that 5 times more likely to be NEET. More than half of the NEETs currently fall into that category, having experienced child poverty, so 5 times more likely as a result of that. Could I just move on and sort of turn it on its head? What do we have evidence? I've got one paper here from last year on the impacts on child poverty reduction targets, and that how that would impact on the on public health and health inequalities. So we know that child poverty increases impacts on infant mortality. For every 1% additional children living in poverty, we know that there will be nearly 6 additional infant deaths that won't reach their first birthday per 100,000 live births. And I've got some scenarios here, if I could read them out, and I don't know if you've got similar sort of evidence around that. But for different scenarios around targets for child poverty, it's suggesting that high ambition reduction in child poverty, that's reducing by 25%, would decrease total cases of infant mortality by 293, and this is from now really to 2033. It would decrease the number of children looked after children by nearly 5,000. It would decrease nutritional anemia by nearly 500, and emergency admissions by, wait for it, nearly 33,000. So very significant, and also has a regional impact as well. And I wondered if, there's something that we need to recognise around setting targets around reducing child poverty and the impact that will have, not just obviously on the crucial thing of keeping our children safe, enable them to thrive, but also in terms of public spending around our NHS and social services.
Sophie Howes.
Yeah, I mean, I just to say that I think CPAD and the wider anti-poverty sector is strongly supportive of the idea of the inclusion of child poverty targets in the child poverty strategy, and I think the government themselves have set out that they envisage the strategy being a 10-year strategy, and I think recognising that we will need to make kind of incremental progress in reducing child poverty, because there's lots of work to do, but having a time frame like that will allow us to do some really good stuff and then see that the knock-on impact in terms of wider children's outcomes, everything my colleagues have said around the kind of in the education space, but also thinking about health. Specifically on health, I thought it was just it's a very small scale piece of research, but we did a survey with paediatricians over the summer. So we did a survey of 371 paediatricians with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, asking them about how child poverty basically manifests in their working life, and they were really, really clear. So they said 99% of respondents to that survey reported that poverty is contributing to ill health among the children that they treat. 96% of them said poor housing conditions were affecting the health of the children that they treat. And just couple of very short quotes. So one paediatrician saying, "We have had children on chemotherapy die because they have caught fungal infections from damp housing." And another quote saying, "I've written more letters to housing providers to ask them to address damp and mould urgently for children with chronic respiratory conditions in the last 2 years than I have in the previous 18 years of my consultant career." So yeah, just to really concur with what you've said, Debbie, and I think there's lots and lots of evidence out there to support that.
Thank you very much, Ms Abrahams.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Stewart, it's sometimes said that policies to reduce child poverty pay for themselves. I'm thinking particularly as an example of the work of Nobel laureate James Heckman, who modelled out the economic metrics of early intervention, how they're exponentially more effective. So can you justify some of these interventions on financial grounds alone?
Yes, I think we can. I kind of wish we had accounting systems which allowed us to consider child investment and child benefits on the investment side of the spreadsheet rather than just as day-to-day spending, because I think the evidence is strong that you by spending money on this area and reducing child poverty, you bring down costs elsewhere, and that's both in the immediate term and in the longer term. So I think immediately we know that we're spending a lot of money on other services as a result of child poverty. That's on education, on health, on children's social care. All of those things are pushed up by child poverty. And Donald Hirsch has done numbers on that, and it's high numbers of billions. So I think he thinks that we are spending something like, is it 20 billion extra, are his estimates. We're spending £20 billion a year additionally on public services as a consequence of child poverty. And then projecting forwards, given that there's fairly good evidence that children are not fulfilling their potential and will grow up to be less likely to grow up to be taxpayers or higher rate taxpayers and more likely to need support of their own in the future, that's another. He thinks that there's 12.3 billion in lost earnings for those adults, and another 7 billion for the exchequer in terms of lost tax and higher benefits. What he doesn't do is then project what we're spending on health because adults grew up in poverty and have worse health now. So that's probably a conservative estimate. Yeah. But yeah, we're talking like over 40 billion, I think. 40
billion. Okay. So so I know it's an area that my colleague Helen Hayes MP as chair of the Education Committee has a particular interest in. But if we think today's SEND system, where typically an 11-year-old ends up leaving school for 2 years perhaps because they don't get support until they get expelled. There are 1,800 children in Surrey in that situation right now. That almost by definition wrecks their life chances. It's often family breaking. One parent frequently quits work to look after their child, which has a massive impact on their career, and quite often that child will end up in social services in their 20s instead of employment. So is there modelling out there comparing the overall cost of that to what we were just speaking about earlier in terms of a model based, which may be more expensive at the outset, but based on early intervention and effective support going forward?
The overall cost of investing in the SEND system compared to the overall
cost of what it is right now.
There may be, but I could not tell you. And of course, that's an overlap there. There's going to be an overlap. That's going to be, for many children, that's going to be set. It's not the same as child poverty, clearly, but there will be an overlap. So I think this.
And so, of course, where I'm going with this, and perhaps it's for Dr. Cribb as well. Should and could the Treasury be making the case that if you were to intervene early or in some of these other interventions, that actually that is going to reduce debt to GDP over the long run, and therefore one should be going to the OBR and not just taking up the upfront costs of these interventions, but also the impact on future GDP when considering and going out to markets in terms of thinking in terms of borrowing.
Yeah.
And does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think one could make a very strong case for that, and I guess one of the big questions is why that doesn't seem to cut, why those arguments don't seem to. It's a bit of a no-brainer that investing in children is a good idea in the long run. Why that doesn't translate into policy, I guess, is to do with political cycle, and that it's hard, and discounting of the future. But yeah, I think you can make a strong case for it.
Yeah. I think that there's a good case that more money for poor children is good is beneficial to them for it in itself, and there are potentially extra benefits on a range of outcomes. I'm a little bit more sceptical about the idea of it paying for itself. I think, but I don't want to get into a huge argument over that. Let me say where I think is more plausible and less plausible. I think it's more plausible if you really have very deep levels of poverty, that bringing people out of the very deep levels of poverty to a kind of more marginal form of poverty is likely to have bigger impacts in general than getting people across a poverty line. I think that there are policies. There are some American academics who try and look at kind of every policy and this kind of question. That those that look like they pay for themselves look a little bit more like early child development kind of policies, helping people in a holistic way rather than kind of giving cash. You'd have to ask the OBR itself for this, but I would assume, given how they score things, that they probably are slightly sceptical that these really do pay for themselves, because otherwise they would be scoring them in that way.
Ms. Howes, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess just to build on that point of, even if you just focused on families that are or children that are in deep poverty, and we would be very clear at CPAG that the forthcoming child poverty strategy must be more ambitious than that. But we're still talking about 3.1 million children who are living in deep poverty. That number has risen from 2.9 the previous year. So, children who are living in deep poverty and experiencing the kind of worst adverse effects of growing up in poverty, that's still a really sizable number of children.
Professor Stewart, you were talking about why the Treasury doesn't invest to save, but I mean the real challenges, aren't there, that investing to save, the Treasury naturally has a bit of a conservatism with a small c about putting money in before they can see the results of it. Can you think of any examples where there has been good invest to save that you could highlight? Or, I mean, you were talking about the electoral cycle, that's obviously a part of the challenge.
Yes, well, I mean, so talking about this is early years intervention, but the Sure Start, IFS work showing that Sure Start has reaped long-term benefits as it was predicted to do, and we had to wait 20 years to see the full effects of that. So there's an example.
It's often a 20-year payback, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the point. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to welcome Helen Hayes, Chair of the Education Select Committee, to guest with us today. So, Helen,
thank you very much for having me, Chair. I wanted to drill down a little bit into exactly that example that you just mentioned, Professor Stewart, about the Sure Start evaluation, which shows very clearly, kind of 20 or so years on, that children who lived in close proximity to a Sure Start centre achieved better GCSE results, and that there was a direct link between the presence of Sure Start and those kind of better exam results at the end of the day. There is similar analysis that my committee drew on in our report on children's social care that highlights the correlation between the decline in Sure Start centres and the numbers of children entering the care system, which have risen very, very dramatically. And I just wondered, I don't think that a straightforward invest to save analysis applies, because there is obviously expenditure on those public services that is a direct cost to the Treasury. I don't think we kind of can understand how the Treasury's accounting processes works, but I wonder whether there is, drawing on some of those longer term analyses, a better outcomes related framework that could be brought to bear, learning the lessons. I think it would have been harder to have dismantled Sure Start if that very clear direct link between improved exam results, which is also a proxy for economic activity later in life, was known at the time at which those decisions to cut were made. So I'm just asking, I suppose, about the role of longitudinal research, what we can learn from those analyses that have taken place over the last 20 years or so, and whether there are outcomes-related metrics that we can start to apply to decisions about public expenditure going forward.
Yes, well, I would like to see that, certainly. I guess I'm slightly sceptical about whether that would have been enough. You know, if we'd had those results for Sure Start earlier, would it have saved Sure Start? When we know what happened to Sure Start was that it was delegated. You know, the funding was unring-fenced and allowed to go down to local authorities, and local authorities were, many of them who wanted to protect Sure Start, were in an impossible situation where they had to meet statutory requirements. So, you know, I think Sure Start was known to be popular, and there was a sense it was known to be popular, and there was a sense it was having an impact. We didn't have the evidence. So there's always going to be politics, isn't there, and ideology involved. But that said, I would agree that I mean, I think it's something that maybe we should think about, is how to build this more clearly, outcome-related metrics more clearly into thinking about invest-to-save models.
Can I say the importance of studying these things over a really long period of time, though, because really it's really the further away we've got from it, the more we've seen that Sure Start's really important, and it was quite hard to see that after a very short period. You know, it turns out that policymakers have moved, or previous government moved in a different direction on Sure Start, but you know, I think it is very hard to be able to tell policymakers that we have to wait for a very long period of time to know things. I think the best way to make policy in that is to try to design programs that you think, based on other things, are going to work, and then to leave them to bed in for good amounts of time, because, you know, looking very short run outcomes on its own doesn't seem to be enough.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There is some work done in Whitehall to make sure that projects have evaluation built in from day one. But you're right, a 7-year minimum period is impatient. Politics doesn't always wait for that. Sorry,
I was just going to say, I completely agree, and we do. But why don't we do have, you know? So now we've got evidence on Sure Start. Let's bring back Sure Start. Save money in the long run. Let's do it, and let's not get too. Yeah, the short-term effects on the early years foundation stage profile. Maybe we need to, you know, not reach too much into that.
Thank you very much. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Stewart, this might be for you. One of the justifications for the two-child limit when it was first introduced was about making sure that parents are more financially responsible, maybe choosing not to have more children. Have we had any evidence since 2017 that that's impacted on parents' decision-making?
Decision-making around fertility, particularly,
yes.
and having children, yes. So I've been part of a project looking over 5 years at different impacts of the two-child limit, and part of that we looked at fertility. We only looked up to the first 3 years, but over that period we found very small to not either negligible effects on fertility. And what's nice about our project is that we both do quasi-experimental quantitative research, but we've also done qualitative work alongside that, and so that's shed quite a lot of light on why not. I mean, bearing in mind that we've only talked to families who did go on and have a child, but talking to them about their decision making, I think really underlines that it's really complicated. People's lives are complicated and messy. So a few factors. One is that many parents didn't know about the policy, so that is something that may have changed over time. However, many parents, it just was not in part of something they were thinking about, because they were actually not receiving benefits at the time. You know, things were good, they had a third child, and then the relationship broke down, or they became bereaved, or, you know, a child had a disability and one of them had to leave work in order to look after the child. So, you know, people aren't making decisions about their child with perfect foresight, and that was very clear, certainly in our qualitative sample.
Could I just pick up on one point you said there? Because obviously you said you're speaking to people that kind of had the child, so by definition they're probably more likely to be less aware of the impacts they haven't necessarily considered. So have we got any evidence more broadly of general awareness of it, whether people have decided not to have children on the basis of the fact that they've worked out they're not going to have?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's why we need both the quantitative and the qualitative. So the quantitative is telling us there wasn't really an effect, and the qualitative is telling us, why do people go on and have that third child? And the third thing I'd highlight is that often, it's not a choice. Often, people get pregnant by mistake, contraception fails. And also in our sample, there was, our sample was about 35 families affected by the 2-child limit, and in 3 cases there was coercion was involved. So there
is an exception for that.
There is an exception, but families, we found, don't always want to claim that. It's quite difficult. Yeah. You have to get a social worker or a doctor. You have to not be living with the perpetrator. Get a social worker or a doctor to testify. And so one mother told us, I don't want my child, I don't want any risk that she ever finds out that was how she was conceived. So I would rather not take the money and not have paperwork somewhere that says I got that exception. So
just say sometimes people don't realise it's coercion. It's just life.
Thank you. Sophie Howes.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that point. CPAG took a legal case around the non-consensual conception exemption in the 2-child limit, which is actually, we're in the process of kind of appealing that at the moment. But in that process, we've had lots and lots of women get in touch with us as an organisation who are precisely in that situation. So they're just experiencing lots of practical difficulties even where they want to actually access that exemption. So as Kitty says, there's lots of women who maybe decide that they're not even going to volunteer that information, but even where people are doing that, lots of practical issues are coming up. So I think it's just really important to highlight that you can have an exemption in place, but in terms of how actually people practically access it, that on something as sensitive as this just means that women are missing out. Women and children are missing out.
I could push on this point a little bit further, because it is one of the primary arguments made at the moment, even in politics today, right? People are saying that parents need to take more responsibility. What about, and I admit this would be a smaller sample, what about those people who've had a third child and then probably have become aware of the cap being in place? Does that affect their decision making to get into a fourth? Do we have any debate about data relating to that, or is it too small of a sample?
Well, we were looking at whether you had a third or subsequent, a child who would be affected, and we didn't find there was impacts, but there may be more up-to-date research that finds there is, but I would imagine it would be small.
And if you want to come in as well, obviously we've got data available from 2017. I'm conscious of what you said before, how policymakers are impatient. Do you think we've got enough data to make assessments on behavioural change of this policy yet?
I don't really have anything to add on this point.
Okay, thank you. The next point I wanted to come to was about whether or not having this policy in place makes sense for the country's finances anyway. I think Chris Coughlin kind of mentioned one end of the scale, but the other is just that we have declining birth rate in this country. The OBR highlight the UK's ageing demography has been one of the central challenges. So, Dr. Cribb, I don't know if you have any comments on whether or not it makes sense to have an effective, disincentive for people to have larger families baked into government policy.
Well, okay, so if it's not having an impact, if it's not pushing down fertility, then alleviating it is unlikely to boost fertility. So it doesn't seem to me likely that, irrespective of these problems, it doesn't seem to be suppressing it. But if what you want is a higher fertility rate, it doesn't seem to be that this is the key problem with the fertility rate. I think, if you see what you can only have it kind of both ways. You can only have it one way. Sorry, it either isn't. Yes.
But if you accept the prior evidence we've heard in this panel today,
in fact, then it doesn't seem to be a way to. Then abolishing it is not therefore a lever to increase the fertility rate.
So I put the question because it's another argument made, and I just want to try and make sure we flash them all out on the panel today. The next area I want to move on to is employment, if I can. Because that's the other end of it. Maybe people would decide that they're going to work more if they could. Perhaps if one parent isn't at work, they'd want to come into work, or maybe they want to take on more hours if they were currently working reduced hours. Is there any evidence from any members of the panel about this policy having an impact on employment rates?
Yes, we looked at that too as part of our bigger project, because again, that was the second sort of key aim, is that people would work more. Although remember that, you know, half families affected are already working. But we looked at quantitative and qualitative data, and we found no significant effect on the likelihood of working, either for lone parents or for coupled parents. There's another study out which finds a very, very small effect, but it uses very different methodology. Our study finds no effect. We do find small positive effects on working hours for coupled mothers who are already working. So if you're a coupled mother and you're already working, we found that you would work 2 or 3 hours extra per week. And that's actually consistent with the idea that those families are kind of phasing out of universal credit earlier because of the 2-child limit, because their entitlement goes down, and so so we know that universal credit has this effect on negative effect on the work incentives of second earners because of the withdrawal rate. So it may be that those families, who are the relatively better off ones among the group affected by the 2-child limit, they're finding it more worthwhile, so they're increasing their hours a little bit. But for most families who are experiencing it as a kind of just a big hit on their total income, they're not responding by compensating with employment earnings, which, you know, maybe is surprising because it's quite a big hit. It's £3,000 per year. Our qualitative work was again really interesting and really insightful in terms of what's going on. And I would say a small number put very high priority on being present for their children in the early years. So they were saying, this is the right thing for me to be doing. I'm really committed to this. I think my children need me, even if there's a financial hit. You know, I'll move into work once they go to school, as I would have done, but I want to do this now. More common was parents who were really keen to work, but they faced really significant barriers, and that was why they weren't working. That's why they're affected by the 2-child limit. That's why they need the support, because often they faced significant barriers in terms of childcare. Often there were health issues of parents or children. So a number of families with a disabled child who were saying, I'd love to work, but just right now I can't. I need to be looking after my child. And then the third thing is we also found families where it felt like it was pushing them further away from the labour market, not having enough money. So the costs of that upfront cost of childcare, transport, clothes for interviews and so on were really, that was much more difficult because of I guess the time as well and the energy of living on a low income. We spoke to one mother who had knitting machines and she'd sold them to make ends meet. So that's an example of how, you know, sometimes not having enough money makes it actually harder to build a...
Just one final question, because I think from my question what I've worked out is that it hasn't had much of an effect on birth rates, it hasn't had much effect on employment rates, so the only final stated policy intention was whether or not it was having an effect on the welfare bill. Clearly, obviously, it's going to cost money to restore it, but is there any evidence that it's actually helped to reduce the welfare bill over time, or has it had an impact in different ways?
Well, it saved about £3.5 billion a year and rising every year as more and more children are affected. But of course, that's having a cost in terms of other public services, and there are future costs as well. So I would say it's short-term saving. Short-term saving if you look narrowly at the policy, but wider costs.
I'm afraid
you've got to rush on. I think we're going to continue on while the colleagues are voting. So thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Dame Harriet Baldwin, MP. We might just let the bell ring, Rita, so we can hear your dulcet tones.
Yeah,
we just hope your last answer wasn't lost under the bell. It seemed a long time when you're waiting for it, doesn't it?
3, including the chair. Guests don't count. The whip said everyone else is comfortably quorum.
I whip said this morning we don't normally vote on these things.
Okay. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Chair. And my first question is for Dr. Cribb, please. There will be a lot of people listening who perhaps won't be aware of where the poverty line is currently drawn for a family with 2 children and a family with 3 children. So I just wondered if we could have some IFS-style facts on where that poverty line is today for a family with 2 children, a couple with 2 children, after housing.
Oh, goodness. Do any of my colleagues have the exact
figures? No.
I've got the HBAI figure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is £550 a week for a couple with 2 children, and around £400 for a single parent with 2 children. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
So that's about £2,200 a month, a bit more than that. So about £25,000 a year. This is after housing, after tax, and for a couple with 2 children.
No, it's not after tax.
No.
Yeah, it is. It needs to be net incomes. I mean, AHC there. So after housing costs.
Right,
yes, it'd be after tax. These are going to be, these poverty lines are always after tax, after benefits, all income included, adjusted for the family size, and then most of us would then deduct housing costs.
2 children,
Yeah.
the IFS would agree that the number we're talking about is about £2,500 a month.
Yeah, I mean, that's the government's numbers on the government headline statistics, and we use those along with everyone else.
So can the panel clarify what the amount would be for a couple with 3 children then?
If you can't tell us now, you can always write to us.
We can write to you, yes.
I just think it'd be helpful for the general population to understand what the numbers that we're talking about. And then I think the other piece of information that'd be helpful, I don't know, Dr. Cribb, if you have this, is how clustered a couple with 2 children would be around that £2,500 after tax, after housing amount. In other words, what is the distribution of poor families? Are many of them around that income level? Or, and I think, Ms. Howes, you had referred earlier to deep poverty, and I just wondered, of that portion of families that we're talking about who are under the 60th percentile of median income at the amount that we just said, what the distribution of those families looks like.
Okay, so I don't think that there's I think there's quite a lot of children around this poverty line, a bit above, a bit below. I don't think that there's, the income distribution doesn't look dramatically strange on either side. It's not like everyone is clustered just above or below. But I do have some numbers. So child poverty, if you define 60% of median income is 30%. If you define it as below 50% of median income is 20%. So kind of 10% of children have income between.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And then just have one more number is below 40% of median income. You've got 10% of children below 40% of median income.
I think there'll be a lot of pensioners in my constituency who'll be hearing, after housing, after tax, an income of about £2,500 a month disposable. Doesn't feel to them like, really difficult levels of deep poverty. But you're saying that there is then a much poorer group of people. And so really my question to the panel is something that would alleviate that much deeper poverty a change in the number of children for whom you received child tax credits? Is that going to be the meaningful thing? Because I think Gordon Brown used to get criticised a certain amount for sort of having poverty plus a pound and sort of making the statistics look a lot better by taking people up a pound over those cut-offs. So I'm just wondering what interventions for the people in deep poverty, children in deep poverty in this country, would be most effective?
Oh, maybe I can start. And a couple of things. One is there was that critique of the 60% of median around the falls in child poverty under the new Labour government. my memory of this is that that there were, particularly big falls in child poverty on that particular metric, but it was not dramatically different compared to if you went to 65% a median or 55% a median. They were quite broad based around that part of the income distribution. For people at the very bottom of the income distribution, I think there's a couple of things to remember. Some people will always be there very temporarily. Some people will have extremely low incomes and be there temporarily.
Maybe claiming asylum or potentially very limited in terms of their incomes.
Honestly, you get quite a lot of people who are like self-employed, they're starting up a business, they have very low earnings for a while, they're not actually particularly poor. I'm just clarifying before I make a further point, which is there are some people at the very bottom of the income distribution who don't look that poor. Let's put them to one side for one moment. Once you go to the very bottom of the income distribution, you are even more disproportionately focusing on workless households.
Persistent, deep poverty.
Right. Because so when we think about the benefits of in-work benefits, working more hours, high minimum wage, all these kind of things that may play a role for people around the poverty line. That's quite different when you're focusing on the very poorest, who are, more persistently out of work. I think it's fair to say, while the welfare system is not the only lever the government can or should be thinking about in this system, that social security is going to play a particularly important role for this kind of persistent, poor, out-of-work group.
Can I?
You, Ms. Howes, did you want to add anything on this point about deep poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to make the obvious point that the families that will be in the deepest poverty, it correlates with the kind of higher levels of need and therefore higher costs. So, larger families where disability might be a factor. I think what you said about migrants is a huge factor actually. So people who have no access to the social security system, and I think JRF have done some quite interesting work which looks at that correlation between those families who are in very deep poverty and the high numbers of those that would be migrants. I think in terms of interventions that target families in deep poverty, we've talked a bit about the two-child limit, and it's worth highlighting that the two-child limit is the most cost-effective way of lifting families out of poverty, so 350,000, but it also would mean that 700,000 children are living in less deep poverty, so it is very effective in terms of deep poverty. But the other policy is the benefit cap, so it affects a much smaller group of families, but those families are living very, very far below the poverty line. So if you scrap the benefit cap, those families would still be living in poverty, but they would just be living kind of further up closer to that line. So I think it is really important that we do remember that policies that target those families who are living in deep poverty need to be an important part of this picture and part of the forthcoming strategy.
Can I give a number on that? We think that if you remove the two-child limit, it reduces deep child poverty by 110,000. And if you do that and remove the the benefit cap and the two-child limit, we think it goes to 200,000. So almost doubles the impact on deep poverty.
Where are you drawing the deep line? Is that this?
Below what we've done is below 40%.
Yeah, ours would be below 50%, so that's why the numbers are higher.
Okay. Just thank you for clarifying.
So you'll follow up with some facts about the income level that will be required to go from the about £2,500 a month after tax and housing costs for a couple with 3 children. We'll follow up with some facts on that for the committee. Thank you.
Can I just to follow up on that? So of course I can understand that a pensioner might look at that and think, well, that's a lot of money. But of course what we're doing is equivalising. We're trying to adjust for the household needs. And so we're adjusting working out what income that family would need because they've got the higher levels. And actually, when we do...
I just was asking what the difference was.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we can have that. We'll follow up in writing. John Glenn, MP.
Yes, thank you. I think in your answers to my colleague Bobby Dean, you suggested in essence that the qualitative and quantitative data demonstrates that the two-child policy has very little behavioural effect. We've also discussed the challenge of short and long-term changes. You know, there is evidence to suggest if you invest a lot in the short term, you can have a change over time. But the reality is, howsoever, whether right or wrongly, our politics and cycles are set up, every fiscal event has a lot of pressures. I suppose this comes down to, we would think about the Chancellor's actual choices of direct money transfers to alleviate child poverty, versus those longer term inducing behavioural changes, you know, doing things that actually grow capacity for people to help themselves. How do you see her choices, and what is the most effective use of very limited resources in these fiscal circumstances to actually make direct transfers to alleviate poverty?
Who first?
To Professor Stewart, please.
So I think it's very clear that it's much more cost effective to make the transfers to the families with children. And that's partly because we know that if the alternative is to invest in employment support, which I would also like to see, it's really, all the estimates suggest it's really expensive to do that. I mean, we should be doing it, but given what Sophie said earlier, that a lot of parents have moved into work over the last decade. It's been quite a success story in that respect. So the parents who aren't working are often facing significant barriers to work, and so you're talking about quite extensive personalised support, and so there's a lot of money there. And then all the simulations done by IFS, Resolution Foundation, show that even if you get parents into work, actually, in terms of reducing child poverty, it's not, you know, it gives you much less sort of bang for your buck than investing in the social security system. Now, I understand that if you see it through the lens of kind of, if your thought is there are people sitting at home doing nothing, we're just giving them money, isn't it better in the long run to encourage them to go out and look for work? But I think that that's a false representation of what we see. I think we're seeing a lot of families in work, working the hours that they can given their caring responsibilities, really struggling, and that money would really make a difference and help them invest in their children. Other families who, in the short term, right now, working is difficult because of a disabled child, for example. And so supporting them through that period, which is what a social security system is designed to do, can actually, giving them that support now, it may even make it easier for them to move into work in the long run.
So essentially this is a prerequisite for progress for social mobility, because you won't get that far unless you remove the poverty in the short term. Absolutely,
that's a much nicer, more succinct way of doing it. Saying it than
very rarely succinct, as Becky points out. Dr. Cribb, would you like to say anything complementary or additional to that?
I mean, I think from the view, look, what I would say is the amounts of money we're talking about in terms of abolishing the 2-child limit, clearly we're in a difficult fiscal situation. I think but the amounts are not so dramatic to abolish the 2-child limit that they don't come along the kind of the kinds of policies that even fiscally constrained chancellors have chosen to do, even at difficult budgets. You know, these are. If this was £20 billion or 10-15 billion pounds, it gets a lot harder to kind of essentially bring a package together that comes together that meets the government's own objectives. I think, given the scale of this, about £3 billion or so, I think that if a government's number one priority was to abolish this 2-child limit, then the fiscal position of the country does not preclude that. Is what I'm saying.
So previous recent governments have used the Household Support Fund as a sort of top-up mechanism. How does that equate, given it allows more discretion at local authority level? It's just not of a quantum that's big enough to move the dial. Would that be the argument?
My knowledge of the Household Support Fund is not enough for me to give you a good answer on that. I can write to you if you want, or colleagues can come, but I don't want to say things I don't know.
I think Ms. Howes, you were
I mean, I guess just on your point around sort of 2-child limit versus other measures, and I think just to reiterate what's been said, really, I think we would see it very much as like a foundation on which to build. And if we kind of play out that scenario where you don't scrap the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, and you kind of invest in other things, maybe non-social security related things, I think the reality is that it will just act as a drag on those interventions. Those interventions will not be as effective. So I think, you know, we would very much see it as like a foundationary piece to this forthcoming strategy. On the Household Support Fund, I mean, I think just the scale of investment, I would have to remind myself, I think it's about £1 billion, isn't it, that's given
recurring
out to,
each year.
each year to local authorities. I think, you know, it's a discretionary payment. We know from our work with families that there's lots of trouble accessing, people are not aware of it. You know, it's just not able to provide that support in the systemic way that we know that children and families need it. So, you know, whilst it's a really, really important part of the social security system, and it's really it should be there for, you know, crisis situations, really, the idea that it could sort of, you know, plug the gaps in an inadequate social security system is flawed, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn. Helen Hayes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, on the basis of your research, what a kind of truly ambitious approach to tackling child poverty would look like. It seems to me that we're talking about kind of how to get over a certain baseline at the moment, and the way that poverty is measured. When we talk about lifting children out of poverty, what we're actually talking about is lifting them from something that is very, very definitely poverty into something that probably looks quite a lot like it still. We're not talking about kind of really raising the level of household income to a particularly comfortable standard of income, and we're not necessarily talking about all of the other improvements in support and in access to services that might really kind of make a substantial difference. So I just wondered, on the basis of your research, what does ambitious look like in this space?
Just to clarify, when you say it wouldn't be transformative for families, you mean just getting rid of the 2-child limit, or getting rid of poverty? But just
so I'm not saying that relieving the 2-child limit wouldn't be transformative. I think it would be transformative, but I think we would still essentially be seeing lots and lots of children living in households with very low levels of income, albeit a level of income which is above a technical definition of poverty. So what I'm interested in is the kind of above and beyond. If we accept the baseline, where do we then go next if we're aiming towards a country where every child is really thriving?
Yeah. So scrapping the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, which is a really important part of the story, should be just the very first step. And then I think, first of all, there's much more we need to do to build a more comprehensive social security system, and I think that would start with looking at local housing allowance, which is we're targeting after housing cost poverty, and it's really important that we think about housing costs, and that's really an important part of the story. And we also need to look at wider uprating of child benefits over time. So just like the triple lock has helped the state pension to really get to a level at which it's a reasonable level of income, we need to do the same for child benefits. Think about where the floor should be, and design our social security system so that we don't need to have a big argument about it every year. We build that in, so we're heading in that direction. So, and we would also, I think universal child benefit would be a part of that picture too, if we want every child to thrive. So recognising that all families need support for children at some stages in their lives. So that's social security. I mean, that would be about the income. I think if we saw all of those things in terms of family income, that would be hugely different from where we are today. But then I think we would want to be looking at childcare, housing, early years, and education. I think are the kind of 4 sort of planks. We've just been talking about how fiscal constraints. So recognising that it's difficult at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hayes. It's a very good table that the IFS has produced, Dr. Cribb, in your October 24 Child Poverty Trends and Policy Options. And that indicates that once the 2-child limit is fully rolled out, that every category of child, whether their ethnic background, their housing background, whether it's lone parent couples, in work, out of work, all go up. I just really wanted to give an opportunity. We've talked a bit about other options that are long-term around housing and work and so on, as Mr Dean highlighted. And I think you've been very clear in your position at Child Poverty Action Group, Ms Howes. But is there anything else that could be done to keep that figure down? You're saying that you've been very clear that the 2-child cap is the main thing. Is there anything else that can be done in the short term, given that the Chancellor's going to face choices at the budget? And a lot of pressure on this issue for all the reasons we understand. Is there anything else that could be done at the budget that would make a big, significant difference, picking up on what Mr Glenn was asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the 2-child limit needs to go, and it needs to go because it's going to stop child poverty rising. It's probably worth just being really explicit about that. That wouldn't actually cause a huge it would lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty, but in the alternative scenario where that doesn't happen, CPAD estimates child poverty will reach 4.7 million. I mean, I think if we want to look at kind of equivalent reductions in child poverty without scrapping the 2-child limit, it's really difficult to do that. I mean, we've looked at other alternatives within social security spending, so you could get an equivalent number of children out of poverty if you put money into the child element of universal credit, but that would cost 50% more than the 2-child limit. You could increase the standard allowance, but that would cost £8 billion to get 350,000 children out of poverty. So the other kind of alternatives in the social security space are more expensive, so it's definitely the most cost-effective kind of option in terms of number of children lifted out of poverty per pound spent. I mean, if you talk about wider measures, so thinking about housing or thinking about childcare or those things, there's no equivalent in terms of things that you could do in the short term. Those things are really important, should be a really important part of the strategy, as Kitty has said, but they are things that will reap results in kind of 10, 20 years. That's just the reality. So we really do need the short-term bit, and I'm reluctant to say that social security is a short-term thing, because we do really want people to view it as an investment in children, and it's something that will always be there. But that's the thing that's going to make the critical difference now.
Okay. Any of the other panelists, anything to add to that? Anything that could be done? Any quick fixes for the Chancellor?
Quick fixes. Well, I mean, I definitely think we want to highlight I would highlight the benefit cap as absolutely essential. So the 2-child limit without the benefit cap will leave many families in very deep poverty. Local housing allowance, I think, would be the next thing on the list.
So already all the quick fixes are in social security. I mean, this is what we're all the employment and other things are just going to take too long to deliver in this Parliament.
Yeah,
if we take
to deliver results in this Parliament.
They're expensive and they're longer term.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Jim Dixon.
Yeah, just quickly, just building on that, you talked about particular demographics being affected by the 2-child cap. So you talked about obviously families with larger children, and that being perhaps disproportionately some BAME groups. Are there any others that you'd point to, like are the sort of numbers of adults in the household a part of the story here, the working status of the parents, any other characteristics of those who are affected specifically by the 2-child cap as opposed to wider poverty?
Are you happy for me to take that? Yeah. So, I mean, just to reiterate what's already been said by others, I mean, the majority of families that are affected by the 2-child limit are working. So, 59% of them are working. And actually, if you look at the breakdown in terms of, so it's 450,000 families affected, the most recent set of data published by DWP provides a breakdown of kind of conditionality status. So it tells us kind of what are they required to do in terms of working more. And what we see from that is of those 450,000 families, only 160,000 are expected to be looking for work or looking for more work. So the other kind of 290,000 are actually already working enough to like escape the conditionality regime, or they've got very good reasons for not working. So they may have a very young child at home, they may have a disability, they may have a long-term health condition. So I think that's an important part of the picture to understand. And just we've already talked a bit about black minority ethnic families. I think Kitty has already said that they're 3 times more likely to be affected by the 2-child limit, so disproportionately affected by the policy. I mean, I think it's worth just flagging in terms of sort of regional variations. If you look at the different parts of the country where child poverty rates are the highest, so that would be London, the North West, the West Midlands are the three regions with the highest child poverty rates, and where you see constituencies where there's over 50% of children in poverty in some of those areas, compared to the average, which is around 31%. There's just a really strong correlation between those child poverty rates and high prevalence of families affected by the two-child limit. So we can see that it's a very, very strong driver. And you'll be aware that there's kind of no exemption within the two-child limit for disability. So, it is affecting families who have very high barriers to work in a kind of indiscriminate way.
So the conclusion would be lifting the cap not only clearly lifts people out of poverty, but it also is a policy which can support people with a variety of different characteristics like disability who currently aren't getting the support they might otherwise do.
Definitely, and I think that's the there was some questions earlier about the sort of rationale for the policy, and I think the policy was born out of this conceptualisation of benefit claimants as a static group of people who are not working and who are making a decision about a third child when they're in that situation. We know that it's a much more fluctuating population. It's like people are claiming benefits for a whole range of reasons. And I think, when we're looking specifically at two-child limit affected families, the vast majority are either in work or they have a very good reason for not working.
Thank you very much, Ms Dixon. Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was going to ask about the agglomeration effect of London and the North West.
Oh, okay,
but actually, you've answered it. So I just quickly wanted to ask about a benefit that used to be called educational maintenance allowance, because you mentioned older children, and that did have an effect on larger families where there were 2 or 3 teenagers at the same time, meaning there was a greater retention in college or the sixth form, or then that bridge into university. And I think perhaps looking at university retention rates is another really good example, in that it's pretty expensive to go to university, but actually I think it has a long-term value on confidence and all those other things that are very hard to quantify, but probably do lead to improved outcomes financially in the long run. So I was just wondering whether there's any research done on that group, sort of 15 to 19, I guess, that educational maintenance allowance used to help a lot of people in this grouping, and of course it was quite specific to certain parts of the country, but in my case 75% of children in the borough where I was a leader were affected by that one change. And if you can think of 3/4 of families just being whacked at the same time as everything else, LHA and all the rest of it, just wondering if there's any research that's been done on taking that away from this particular group of people and the I guess the way you accrue that impact over your life chances.
Ms Howes, you look like your poised.
Yeah, so CPAG hasn't done any research on that. My recollection, which I'm hoping Kitty might help me out, is that Jane Miller, a colleague of ours, has done some work on the educational maintenance now, an academic based at the University of Bath. I don't know if that's triggering any memories of you, Kitty.
I know that it was evaluated. I mean, that was before it was scrapped. It was positive.
We need to look into that then.
That's an example of a policy where we did know that it was working. We had the evidence at the time, but it was still scrapped. And I guess that plays into Debbie Abraham's question about NEAT. So I think we can look into it, but some interesting research to do that.
Okay, well, if you can point us in the direction, it's always helpful for us to. Thank you. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Just to start a very quick yes/no question, to summarise a lot of what we just discussed. Do you believe that lifting the two-child limit is the most effective way of reducing child poverty with the amount of money that would take, cost-effective wise? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Yes.
I think everyone said that, yes.
Now, there's been a lot of speculation about different alternatives to scrapping the limit, including different ways of tapering or adjusting the limit, which would save small amounts of money in different ways, might reduce the impact. And I was wondering if one of you want to speak to the viability of those alternatives and whether they're cost-effective compared to a complete scrapping of the cap.
So this is under 5s and 3 children limits. Then,
for example.
Dr. Cribb.
Maybe I can. Lots of things have been talked about. Three-child limit. Scrapping if in work. Scrapping of particular ages. Broadly, it sounds a bit crass, but if it costs about half as much as scrapping the whole thing, it has about half as much effect on poverty. You can kind of draw a line, right? If it's 3/4, it costs 3/4 as much as scrapping the 3-child limit, then it's going to have 3/4 of the effect on poverty. Now, who exactly it affects is going to be down to exactly how you do this. If you did a 3-child limit, it would clearly affect people. It would loosen this for everyone, but the people with 4 kids and more would still be capped. So I think so you could design it in lots of different ways, and we could talk about that forever. But I think the big point is all of these different things are kind of halfway houses between either having it or not having it, on both cost and effect on poverty.
Thank you. And if the objective is to make sure that child poverty is lower at the end of this Parliament than at the beginning, do any of those halfway houses get us there, Dr. Cribb? Or
I don't have the.
Can't say that's.
I can't exactly say, but much less you're less likely to get there, certainly, if you only go halfway.
I just wanted to come in. One thing that's been playing out in some of the debates around the idea of kind of compromise positions on the 2-child limit is the idea that there's some kind of economy of scale with raising children. And we published some research last week. Every year, the Child Poverty Action Group publish a report called Cost of a Child, which basically looks at the cost of raising a child to 18 in partnership with Loughborough University. And what that shows is that there is a slight difference between first and second child, but actually once you get from second, third, fourth, subsequent children, there is no notable difference. So, savings that can be made on things like reusing items are just very marginal cost. The things that really cost with children is things like childcare. It's those really big bulky costs, so there are really no differences. So I think that's important for the committee to understand.
Yeah, thank you. And we've just discussed the benefit cap and the impact that has on the poorest families, and Dr. Cribb, in the IFS evidence that we received, there's a statement saying the benefit cap would wipe out the gains of reversing the 2-child limit for some children in the very poorest families. So that's about the deepest poverty. Professor Stewart, you just mentioned the different ways in which the pensions and benefit systems works, and the way in which, for example, pensions are pegged to a triple lock, rising with inflation, earnings, and so on. I'm sure, for the benefit of those who are in the public and not aware of the way that our very complex benefit systems work, could you just explain how the benefits cap and the different kinds of child-related benefits we're discussing move over time?
Okay, so the benefit cap, the thing about the benefit cap is it places a total cap on the amount that a family can receive if no one in the household is working or is only working fewer than 16 hours. And so and that includes housing costs. So it's predominantly affecting families who have high housing costs, and it means that the social security system doesn't pay anything like the full housing costs. And those families that are already capped, so those are families who I think are the ones that are living in the deepest poverty in our country. And we included, we've done research on that group as well, and the levels of destitution really that some families are living in are really, really shocking. A family of 5 living on £65 a week after housing costs because the benefit's not covering that cost. So, and the point is that if we lift the 2-child limit, that family is already capped, so they'll see nothing as a result of that. So you're sort of taking out those families, 100,000 families, really at the very bottom, and saying, so lifting the 2-child limit would affect a lot of people across the lower part of the distribution, but you're taking out the very bottom.
And the cap itself doesn't move automatically over time?
No, interestingly, no. It was introduced at a certain level, 26,000, and then it was actually lowered, and then it's only been uprated, I think, once with inflation since then. So every year it bites more and more, and it's pushing people into more and more hardship.
So over time, the amount of families that are affected by it will simply increase unless it's changed in itself?
Yes, the number of families and the extent to which the depth of their poverty, yes.
Yeah. And finally, what are your range of costings for removing both the 2-child limit and then also removing the benefit cap?
Well, I have some of those. So, these are a little bit out of date because inflation. But back last summer, we thought that removing two-child limit was going to cost £2.5 billion. That's probably closer to 3 once you look towards the end of the Parliament. And we thought that adding on the benefit cap would cost an additional 900 million, so maybe an additional billion, in addition to the two-child limit now.
And would you agree with Professor Stewart that you'd like to see a more fundamental reform of the benefit system so that we don't have to have this uprating conversation every few Treasury committees?
So I think that in freezing thresholds, whether it be in the tax system or in the benefit system, is usually not a very good long-run policy.
What would you like to see instead?
Well, I don't have personal recommendations for what I'd like to see. Look, at a minimum, you would expect these things to, in general, at least rise in line with prices. Some governments could then either raise it, index it to something more generous than prices, like earnings, or raise in line with prices with kind of concrete steps to increase it at particular points, depending on their political persuasion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we've probably sort of had this answer certainly very clearly, I think, from Sophie Howes. But given the Chancellor's got choices, which we have touched on a bit, perhaps not as much as we could have done in this hearing, you could remove the two-child benefit cap, but we've talked a lot about children in really deep poverty. So if there was a difficult choice, what would be better, to take the children out of the deepest poverty, or lift the two-child cap and affect more people? And it's a hard choice, but these are the realities of what the Chancellor will be facing. Do you want to go first, Sophie Howes?
I mean, I guess I'd just say it's not an either-or, that the two-child limit would mean that 700,000 children are living in less deep poverty. So I think it does have a substantial impact on deep poverty. That's probably what I would say.
Professor Stewart?
Are you essentially saying benefit cap or two-child limit if we had to choose?
You could cast it that way, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would really hate to see it as an either-or, but I think that both policies are doing a lot of damage. I think the benefit cap is really doing very, very severe damage to children, and I think that would be my number one priority.
Dr. Cribb?
I don't have recommendations here. It's that they have a different set of choices. I mean, of course, there are differences on who's affected. There's also just differences on scale, right? Doing one costs about $1 billion, and doing one costs about $3 billion. So, do you want to spend $3 billion more, or do you want to spend $1 billion more?
And these are the very difficult decisions that the Chancellor has in front of.
Just one thing to note, of course, is if you lift the benefit cap, you really won't affect your child poverty headcount, which I know the government wants to do something about. But
so as the Chancellor has challenging economic and political decisions to make ahead of the budget, and so we hope that this session, and we certainly think our witnesses, have shone very important light on the issue of child poverty, which we know is a very big issue of debate, and I think some of us are living in hopes that something may happen at the budget, but that's a matter for the Chancellor. Even on this committee, we have no inside track, I should stress. But can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. We've had a really useful discussion and an analysis of the available evidence on the impact of child poverty and low income on life chances and outcomes, which I think is very important to have laid out. A discussion about the role of employment support, however important that is, that can't act as quickly as some of the other things we've been discussing. And an examination of policies to address child poverty, including the potential for employment support to reduce that poverty, and the cost of policies to address child poverty and the options for the Chancellors I've just touched on. So thank you to our witnesses. That's Dr. Jonathan Cribb, Professor Kitty Stewart and Sophie Howes. Hansard have been recording the session, and the transcript will be available up on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, so thank you to them and to our colleagues at Bowtie for the broadcasting, and you'll be writing to us on a couple of points, so thank you for that. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Order.